Making a build in Deadlock for the first time as a new player can be a daunting task because there are a lot of things to consider, and you might not know how to get started or where to go next with your build. Hey, what's going on, guys? This is AndrewChicken, and welcome back to another video. Today, we're going to be covering the fundamentals of how to create a build in Deadlock. If you're a new player or a returning player after the item shop rework, then this video will help you to create a build that is effective and custom tailored to your own personal playstyle. Now, if you're a returning viewer, you might be thinking to yourself, hey, wait a second, this video seems oddly familiar, and that's because I have actually made a version of this guide before, but that was with the old item shop a couple of months ago, and so I figured it's about time for an update where we make a new build using the new item shop. So that's what this video is going to be here. So there will be a playlist linked down below with a bunch of other guides if you want to learn more about Deadlock, and if you find these types of videos to be helpful, then I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe. It helps you stay up to date on all my latest videos, and it would really help the channel out a lot as well. It's absolutely free, and so I would really appreciate it. But with all that being said, let's get started. Now, before we even open up the build crafting screen, we first need to define a goal for our build. There are many different build archetypes in Deadlock, and the type of build you play will vary drastically depending on the character that you're playing. So it's important to have a goal in mind so that way you can build towards buffing up your character and really making one or two aspects of that character extremely strong. For today's example, I'm going to be using Viscous because he is an extremely versatile character who can be built in many different ways. And so, how would we actually go about defining a goal for our build with a character like Viscous? Well, we have to take a look at their abilities. So, Viscous has a number of different abilities that will completely define his playstyle. For example, we can do a spirit damage based build with the goo splatter and the goo ball. Both of these deal high spirit damage when you actually build for it, and so it's a very common and very effective strategy to build around these abilities with Viscous. Or we could go for a support and utility based playstyle that revolves around the cube. This ability allows you to save teammates from danger, and so if we pair it with a number of different supportive items, we can create another very effective, very distinct playstyle. Or we could build for the Puddle Punch, which is a melee-based ability, and so if we scale up a bunch of melee damage, we will have another distinct playstyle. Lastly, we could just build for his gun. After all, he does have a gun, just like every other hero in the game, and so there's no reason why you can't build for a gun build on Viscous. I'm going to show you examples of all these different build archetypes on Viscous later on in the video, but for now, I want to walk you through a step-by-step process of how I actually formulate a build in Deadlock, and to do that, we're going to be focusing on spirit damage by building up our splatter and our goo ball. So to actually create your own build, of course, you'll just need to come up here to the build browser on the top right, and then click the Create New Build button, and you'll be met with a fresh new screen right here. Now, there are a lot of things going on here. We have our categories, of course. We can add more categories as needed, and there's a bunch of information on the left here, including our build name, our build description, tags, and our category editing information here, as well as a way for us to assign our ability point order. Now, even if you're not intending your build to be shared with other people, it's still a good idea to include some information here in the build name, the build description, and in the tags, so that way you yourself will understand what the build is meant to be. If you decide to take a break from playing your specific character for a while, or just playing Deadlock as a whole, but then you come back later, maybe weeks or months later, you want to still have an idea of what your build is meant to do. And so it's very important to include these aspects anyways, even if they're just simple descriptions. So I've just written a basic name and description here that says that this build will focus on dealing a ton of spirit damage with the splatter and goo ball. And we can assign tags easily by just clicking on these here, and if you have items in the build as well, you'll be able to click on those to basically mark them as a tag if your build is super focused around a specific item. And of course, you can also just select one of these tags here, like spirit damage. Boom. So there's our tags done and dusted. Now, when it comes to categories, there are a lot of different ways that you can set up your build, and as you become a more experienced and seasoned build crafter, you'll be able to do a lot with these. They're very flexible, and you can create all sorts of categories for specific situations. But when it comes to just general builds, especially when you're getting started, a good format usually looks something like this. You have an early game, mid mid-game and late-game category, and then you also have a situational category for situational items that are good on your character. And sometimes on my builds, I'll call the early game category the build setup, I'll call the mid-game category the build core, which really contains the most important items for my build, and then I'll have a late upgrades category for when I'm done getting everything in the build core. And you can also mark a certain category as optional by clicking this tag here. And so items in this category will not be included by default when the build is added to the auto queue if you're one of the people who auto queues your entire build, but usually this tag is just to indicate that you don't need to buy all of the items in this category. Sometimes you may not need to buy them at all, and usually I like to mark at least the situational category as optional. Generally, people will also sort their categories based on left to right, so you buy the items on the left first, and then you go right through the category. But some people will also have their categories just be a buy-as-you-go category, where you buy whatever item in the category is needed at the time. It's usually a good idea to actually declare what type of category it is in the description. So I usually put at the start of my categories over here in the description, whether it's a left to right category or a buy as needed category. Now, before we start adding items to the build, it's important for you to actually be able to understand what each item does and how to look for items that give you specific perks. Because obviously at face value, you can just look at all of the categories here and you can see that there are a ton of items and you can go through and read all these. And I highly recommend that you do read all of these. But if you just have an idea of like one specific stat that you want to upgrade, you can also just go down here to the search function and it'll pull up every item in the game, and then you can look for a stat like fire rate, and you can actually find all of the items that will give you additional fire rate, or alternatively will lower somebody's fire rate like suppressor here. So you can just search pretty much any stat you can want. You can look up lifesteal, for example, and boom, there's some lifesteal. You can look up reduction, and you can find all kinds of healing reduction. So yeah, this is a good way to find specific items without necessarily knowing the names of them or knowing every single item in the story yet. So what should we do for our early game build setup category? Well, we have a number of different goals here. We need to buy items that help us stay alive in our lane, win our lane, help us farm some souls, so that way we can transition into getting more powerful items in the build core. And we also need to get items that will actually help augment our abilities that we're using in the early game. We're not going to get our goo ball online straight away, and it's more consistent to build around the splatter for the first several minutes of the match. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing. We're going to be putting investment into our splatter, but we're also getting items that when upgraded later will help our goo ball out tremendously as well. So up first, let's talk about early lane sustain. It's usually a good idea to get at least one sustain item in the early game unless you're absolutely dominating your lane, because you're going to get poked out by the enemies and you're going to need some way to heal that back up. So there are 5 important early game healing items, and which one you get depends on your build. The 2 most common are Healing Rite and Extra Regen. These 2 are pretty much universal healing items. Extra Regen is a good healing item because it just passively heals you back up over time, and you don't really need to think about it, it just heals you, no fuss. Healing Rite is a bit more active. You need to actually activate the item for it to start healing you. The healing is much more powerful, but if you take damage from an enemy player, it'll stop healing you. So you have to be smart about how you manage your healing, right? But it is potentially more powerful than Extra Regen, and you can also give it to a teammate if they also need healing. The other 3 items are a bit more situational and depend on your build. Restorative Shot is a fantastic healing item if you're playing a gun build because it gives you more weapon damage, it scales your weapon damage from investing into the category, which is a topic that I talk about in my weapon damage scaling guide, and obviously it gives you a lot of healing, so if you're playing someone like Hayes with a gun build, this is absolutely fantastic. Alternatively, Mystic Regen can be a good idea for some spirit builds, but not necessarily all spirit builds. Obviously, it gives you some spirit power from investing into the category, and it does give you superior health regeneration than Extra Regen, but only if you're able to proc it consistently. So a character like Mirage with his Jin's Mark can get great value out of Mystic Regeneration because it's very easy to apply and it has a very low cooldown. But it's actually not good on a character like Viscous because Viscous's Goo Splash Splatter has a 15-second cooldown, and that's with the tier 1 upgrade. It actually has a 21-second cooldown normally. So this really will not be proccing Mystic Regeneration consistently at all, especially if we miss. The final situational healing item is Melee Lifesteal, which obviously is good on melee builds, and if we were playing Melee Viscous, this would actually be a staple of the build, because it scales up your health, it gives you more melee damage, and obviously it heals you for a lot if you hit an enemy hero. And we could theoretically go for this on our Viscous build here too, even though we are scaling Spirit, just because the Puddle Punch is still a very consistent way to get value out of this item. However, just to keep things simple, we're not going to do that today, so I'm just going to add extra regen and healing right to the build. Now, we don't always want to buy both of these, and I usually end up moving them down here into the situational category, just because we're going to buy them sometimes, we're not going to buy them other times, and I don't really want them clogging up our main early game section. The one time you'd want to integrate them into your build is if you're playing a support-based build who wants to actually upgrade into something like Healing Booster and Healing Tempo, or Rescue Beam or Healing Nova. Now let's add some items to our early game category that are really going to help improve our effectiveness. One thing that I always recommend is to have at least one gun item in your build, even if you're playing a Spirit build. It just helps your gun to not suck and be absolutely worthless. You want it to be doing at least some damage, even if it's just helping you take down an objective faster. In my opinion, the absolute best item for that, if you're just playing a Spirit build and don't plan on getting any other gun items, is Monster Rounds, which gives you a massive damage bonus versus NPCs, and it's very cheap. And NPCs include the creeps on the lane, the NPCs in the jungle, and objectives such as the Guardians and the Walkers. So this is a very valuable item, very cheap, and you don't always have to get it, but I usually find that it's very helpful in a build such as this. Now, if you're playing a gun-focused build instead, you would obviously want to focus on items that will help scale better into the late game, especially against actual players. So stuff like Extended Magazine, Rapid Rounds, Headshot Booster, or Close Quarters, just depending on what you're going for. After that, we want to focus on getting some early power spikes for our splatters. So we can go for Mystic Burst, which gives us a very nice amount of additional damage on our splatter, and Extra Spirit is pretty much a must-have for just about any Spirit build under the sun, because Spirit power is the way that you scale up your abilities to make them do more damage, so we're going to add that as well. Another thing that you might want to consider in the early game for your character is a little bit of extra mobility, because a lot of characters usually want some extra movement for one reason or another. Either it helps them use their abilities better, or they want to traverse the map faster, or they just have poor mobility and so they want to patch up that weakness in their kit. Regardless, there are two major ways that you go for that. You can either go for more raw movement speed in the form of sprint boots and enduring speed, which gives you more sprint speed and movement speed respectively, or you can go for extra stamina, which gives you 1 extra stamina as well as improved stamina recovery, and then this will upgrade into either Stamina Mastery, Kinetic Dash, or Arcane Surge, and those last two are especially powerful for boosting your damage output if you are a gun or spirit build respectively. Viscous is the type of character who really likes extra stamina because he can use it in combination with his Puddle Punch to do some pretty cool rollouts. So we're going to grab extra stamina, and sometimes you want to upgrade into Stamina Master on this character, but for this build we're actually going to upgrade into Arcane Surge because it's way cheaper and it gives us a lot of really good benefits for when we use our Goo Splatter and our Goo Ball later down the line. 15% ability range, duration, and 15 spirit power is absolutely fantastic. If we use a dash jump right before our Goo Ball, this is really going to power it up, so it's a fantastic item. We can add that to our early game build. And we also want to improve our cooldown reduction in this build because, well, our abilities are the primary way that we do damage and get kills, and so we want to have those up as much as possible. So we're going to go ahead and add compressed cooldown and superior cooldown to the build. Now, I actually have compressed cooldown and superior cooldown ahead of extra stamina and arcane surge in my real Goo Ball based build, and that's because I really value having the consistency of the Goo Splatter and the Goo Ball. It's very important for actually making them effective live in the long term, and so we get these online super duper quickly, and you might think that it's a little bit too early to rush a tier 3 item, but in some cases, it is actually a good idea if that tier 3 item is super crucial to the build. Another thing you have to consider sometimes are items that have an imbued ability, like this one, compressed cooldown. So an imbued ability you have to basically assign to one of your 4 abilities, and it will only affect that one ability. So if you actually click on the item here, you can see on the left side of the screen that it has a recommended imbue target that you can select. And I highly, highly recommend that you do select an ability over here to recommend as your imbued target, which in this case, we're going to imbue it on the splatter because for the early lane, that matters a lot more. The reason why it's so important that you denote which ability is meant to have this item imbued into it is because if you come back to the build later and you forget which item is meant to be imbued into which ability, you could potentially ruin your build. For this example, it's actually pretty mundane. It doesn't really matter whether you imbue compressed cooldown into the goo splatter or the goo ball. But on some other builds, you might have 2 abilities that it would theoretically make sense to imbue something into, but imbuing it into one ability is the correct decision, and imbuing it into the other ability will drastically hurt the performance of your build. This is especially important for an item like Quicksilver Reload. So it's very, very important that you actually select the proper target down here. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the early game category here with just a couple of other items that help improve our effectiveness and consistency before we start getting those heavy-hitting build core items. We're going to get Mystic Expansion and go ahead and imbue this onto the splatter just because it helps make that more consistent. And we're also going to get Improved Spirit to improve our damage and Tank Buster as well, which is a fantastic item on this build because it applies a lot of extra damage to splatter and a goo ball. And then finally, we're going to get Duration Extender because we're going to transition into focusing on the goo ball more, and we're going to imbue this onto the goo ball. So now it's time to talk about the mid-game build core section, and this is where we can introduce a couple of new concepts. First of all, of course, we need to pick some items that are going to be the cornerstones of our build. They're really going to define our build and make us into a powerhouse. But we also need to consider a few things. First of all, we have some items in the early game that we could potentially upgrade. We can upgrade Mystic Expansion into Greater Expansion, and we can also upgrade Duration Extender into Superior Duration. And we also need to worry about flex slots, because obviously, if you look on the bottom left, not all of our slots are unlocked right away, and so we need to get those online as the match goes on. In some matches, it can be very difficult to get a high number of flex slots unlocked right away, and so you need to make sure you're not assigning too many distinct, unique items into your build. And so one thing I do usually like to check is that I am able to buy a bunch of items in the early game category and make sure that I'm not running out of slots. So if I just buy all the items in the early game category and buy one situational item, all of my item slots are maxed out. And usually by this point you would already have a flex slot from your Guardians, so you would have one additional slot to think about. And if we don't need our situational item, then we have one further slot open. And we can always sell an item like Extra Regen or Monster Rounds later. They're very cheap and they're meant to be good in the early game but sold later on. So we're actually doing really well on flex slots, and we can add a couple of new distinct items if we want. But if we were pretty tight on slots, then we would want to consider upgrading some of our existing items more than adding new items to the mix. But we also have to be careful with upgrading items, because some items don't actually need to be upgraded. So Mystic Expansion is a fantastic item, and we would probably want to upgrade this into Greater Expansion. The reason for that is Viscous really benefits from range. It makes hitting the splatter easier, and it also makes it way easier to hit people in the goo ball because it makes the physical goo ball much bigger. So Greater Expansion is fantastic, and we will probably add this to the build at some point. But Duration Extender, on the other hand, doesn't really need to upgrade into Improved Duration, or Superior Duration, excuse me. And the reason for that is because the only ability that's really affected by duration is the goo ball. We want to extend our duration in the goo ball by as much as possible, but Getting superior duration is double the price of duration extender. We have to spend another 1600 souls on this. And the comparative boost to our duration is only 6%, right? We only go up from 22% to 28%. That's not a super huge increase. And the extra duration on our other abilities doesn't really matter. Puddle Punch has no duration component, Splatter has no duration component that actually matters, and the Cube does have a duration component, but most of the time we're not staying in Cube for the full duration anyways, so duration on that is also redundant for the purposes of this build. So we can save ourselves 1600 souls by just stopping at Duration Extender imbued into Goo Ball and not upgrading to this version until we absolutely have nothing else to spend our souls on in the late game. Anyways, with all of that being said, let's finally add some items to our mid-game category. So we need to think about items that will complement our key abilities to make them more powerful. In the Goo Ball's case, we do a lot of burst spirit damage, and we like getting up close. Getting up close requires good mobility, so that way we can keep pace with the enemies as they try to get away. So, going for some movement options, going for some items that give us damage up close, and going for items that scale our burst damage are all going to be good here. So you need to think critically about the abilities that you're actually using, and what actually benefits those abilities in particular, because it's going to vary drastically based on every hero in the game, and we can't really cover every single hero, we'd be here all day. So, that's what we need for the Goo Balls. So, we're going to go ahead and add a couple of items here. First of all, Warpstone is absolutely fantastic for our Goo Ball because it gives us an extra movement ability that we can use to tightly maneuver the Goo Ball and hit enemies that are otherwise hard to hit. But of course, we do need to get the Goo Ball up to tier 3 before we do that, because that's when we can finally start to cast abilities and use items while rolling. So, at this point in the build, we can actually get this right away, and we will have this upgrade on time. But in your own build, you may need to consider the timing of this item, because the timing for your build might not work out as well. Anyways, we can also go for Torment Pulse, which is an item that gives us a bunch of extra damage when we are up close. This periodically deals spirit damage over time to the closest two enemies nearby, 44 damage every 1.5 seconds, and it gives us some bonus health and melee resist, which is nice. So we can add this to the build, and that'll scale up our spirit damage even higher when we're up close, and we don't necessarily need to hit people directly with the Goo Ball either to still do damage to them. We just have to really charge down the enemies, and we'll be doing some damage, which is great. And we can start to focus on some tier 4 items at this point, so we could also get Scourge, which is a very fun item. It's basically Torment Pulse, but way better, and on an active ability. It basically creates a damage aura around us that'll deal a percentage of the enemy's max health per second, and it'll also give us a crazy amount of extra health, cooldown reduction, and spirit resist. So this is a really, really good item. We can add it to the build right here in the mid-game category. Another thing that you want to think about in the mid-game category is how you're going to keep yourself alive in the mid-game up through the late game. One such way that we can do that on Viscous is with Spirit Lifesteal, which allows us to heal based on spirit damage that we're doing, and since we're doing pretty much only spirit damage with this build, Spirit Lifesteal will give us a lot of extra healing, and we could theoretically upgrade this into Infuser later. Some people don't necessarily like Infuser on Viscous. I, however, swear by it when it comes to a Goo Ball-based build, because it has saved my life many times. You pop that in a team fight, especially with Scourge active, and you just heal for so much, and the hit points healed back mean a lot because you have so much damage reduction in Goo Ball. So, I like putting that in my build. You don't have to build exactly as I do, but it is, in theory, a good item on Viscous. So, yeah, that's just kind of the general thought process behind it. Ultimately, whichever survival options you go for here will depend on your specific build. So a gun build would much rather prefer Bullet Lifesteal and Vampiric Burst. You could also scale up damage reduction if that's what you need, or you could go for additional health with something like Fortitude. There are a lot of survival options here, and so you just need to think about the type of character that you're playing and build accordingly. It's around this time that I also like to think about adding some other situational items to my build that I would plan on getting around the mid-game. So, those armors that I just mentioned, I usually like to put in the situational category, along with Counterspell. Just some generally helpful situational items, no matter what character you're playing. And we also want to think about what situational items would help our character specifically. For example, we would usually want some kind of anti-healing on our character, but which anti-healing item we go for depends drastically on who we're playing. We don't want to go for toxic bullets on Viscous, for example, because we're in Goo Ball. We can't even shoot, so this would be stupid to have. Instead, we would want to go for Healbane, which applies healing reduction when we hit someone with spirit damage. And later, we could also go for Spirit Burn, which gives a lot more healing reduction and a lot more damage. Debuff Reducer, Remover, and Unstoppable are also pretty good situational items. Some characters will integrate Unstoppable into their build core if you're playing someone like Lash or Seven who needs to not get stunned out of their ultimates. Other times you can put it in the situational category or potentially just not put this item in at all, depending on the character you're playing, but usually Debuff Remover is a pretty universal situational item. It just depends on who you're up against. We could also add some situational debuffs that scale well with our character that we may want to buy in some situations. For example, if we're up against a lot of gun builds, we're playing a spirit heavy build, and so we could actually go for Suppressor and slow their fire rate down when we hit them with spirit damage. This can be good on Viscous because our Torment Pulse, our Scourge, our Goo Ball, and our Goo Splatter will all proc that, and we already have a very high damage reduction stat during Goo Ball, and so if we stacked additional bullet resistance on the Goo Ball, we would run into some diminishing returns. Still beneficial to do, of course, but Suppressor will avoid those diminishing returns entirely. We'll reduce their fire rate by 35%, and then after that's said and done, the remaining damage will be reduced by 60%. So that is very, very helpful. And when dealing with gun builds, we could also add Return Fire, which automatically fires a bullet towards any attacker who damages us. Gun builds can actually be a very big weakness for Goo Ball Viscous because of the armor-piercing rounds item, which causes them to ignore our bullet resistance. Ah, that's scary. So, if we buy Return Fire against someone like Viper who has armor-piercing rounds, then we will be able to highly discourage her from shooting us because she'll be taking a bunch of damage back. So that can be another situational item that's good on this particular character. But your situational category down here might look a little different depending on the character you're playing. Haze probably wouldn't go for either of these, for example. So this is another one of those areas where you'll have to think critically about your character and what benefits them. Now, your build core might be small or big depending on how many big items you actually need and how many tier 4 items you're going for. If you have a lot of tier 4 items, then this category will probably look pretty small, but if your build core mostly consists of a lot of different tier 3s and upgrading other items, then this category could be pretty big. For me, on this build, it's going to stop here with Scourge. And then we're going to go into our late game late upgrades. Now, at this point, when you're in the late game category, you've already got the fundamentals of your build online. You have everything that you need to succeed, and you usually have some situational items online as well. So if I go ahead and unlock my extra slots and go ahead and buy some of these items, you'll see that, okay, I've got one extra slot remaining. If I go ahead and buy a situational item like Counterspell, then my slots are filled up, and I usually have room for, you know, maybe 1 or 2 more items. I can upgrade some of my items previously that I hadn't upgraded yet. I can sell monster rounds and get one more big tier 4 or something like that. And basically, if the game continues on past this point, I want to have some options here that'll further augment my power and synergize with the stuff that I've already got going on. Now, I usually like marking the late game upgrades category as optional because you're not always going to make it to this point. Sometimes the game will end right about when you've got your build core completely finished, or sometimes if it's a really fast game, it'll end before your build core is finished, you know? You might win the game before you're able to get Infuser online, you've just got Spirit Lifesteal and Scourge. Hey, that's totally fine. But if you do get to this category, then just have some items here and say that you can buy as needed and just go based on what you need in the situation. So this is where I like to add some things like Spirit Burn, which is a very powerful late game anti-healing option. You could even buy this earlier in your build if it's really, really needed. But yeah, I usually just slot this into this category on a build such as this that's really focused on spirit damage. And we can also go for some things like upgrading Greater Expansion finally. We can get Diviner's Diviner's Kevlar, which adds additional ability duration and 1,000 extra hit points during our ultimate. That's fantastic. We can add Mystic Reverb in, which is a fantastic item that we could imbue on either the Splatter or the Goo Ball to make it do a lot of extra damage. Usually, I imbue that on the Splatter because it does more damage, and we can throw that onto an enemy to slow them, so that way they can then be hit by the Goo Ball afterwards. We can also add Phantom Strike, which is basically Warp Stone, but on steroids, because it allows us to teleport directly to an enemy target, pull them to the ground, disarm them, make them slower, deal damage. It's really good on Goo Ball Viscous, so we can chuck that in there as well. It's a fantastic upgrade. And at this point, we've got so many items in the category that we can't actually reasonably buy them all in a match, but that's okay. You want to have just good options here, so that way, depending on the situation, you have the items at the ready, at your disposal, to be purchased if necessary. So, one match, I might not need this counterspell down here, and I might have 2 slots open here for me to go for more damage options, in which case, Phantom Strike and Mystic Reverb would be pretty good. But another match, I may need to have 2 situational items, and I can't go for these late upgrades at all apart from upgrading to Greater Expansion. That's fine too. Another match, I might really need the anti-healing, and I might also need a lot of extra survivability, and so we go for Diviner's Kevlar. The point here is to have some flexible options, and that's exactly what we've achieved here. And even when it comes to these early game categories here, it's absolutely okay to break from the set order in some situations. If you have one item that's super imperative for your build that you need to rush, like Echo Shard or Siphon Bullets or something like that, you still want to make that a top priority. But if the situation calls for it, you can absolutely go for extra stamina before compressed cooldown if you have characters like Warden and Haze on the enemy lane that are stealing your stamina. Or you can obviously go down here to the situational category and grab some early situationals if you need them. And in some cases, it's even okay to actually just go over to the item store and buy a specific item that you need, even if you don't have it pre-prepared in your build. For example, I forgot to put Reactive Barrier in this build. That item is very helpful in an early lane against a lot of crowd control. You can absolutely just go over here and buy that and then get back to your early game build order as needed. Just because you have a build doesn't mean that you need to be so rigid and stick to the build no matter what. A good Deadlock player will have the skills necessary to make flexible changes to their build order at a moment's notice based on what the match needs. So, you can make a build here and you want to have some good core key items that you plan on getting throughout the match, but you also want to plan to buy some of these situational items and adapt to your enemy's strategies. Finally, let's talk about assigning the ability point order. This is the order in which you will upgrade your abilities throughout the match. So you can just press this edit button here and then it'll ask you to unlock your abilities and upgrade them. I usually start by assigning the order in which I want to unlock all my abilities first, and then I do the upgrade order after that. So, we're going to start out with the Puddle Punch! Whoa, that's crazy! Yeah, I find the Puddle Punch to just be a better starting ability on Viscous because it displaces the enemies. If you want to buy melee lifesteal, you can, and it procs that consistently. And it also allows you to quickly maneuver out of the way. You can use the Puddle Punch to send yourself back to your Guardian if the enemies are playing super aggressive. It's just versatile. So we unlock that first, and then we unlock the Splatter, then the Cube, and then the Goo Ball. Now, we want to assign our ability points to our actual abilities that we're playing around with the build. So we would put most of our abilities into maxing out the Splatter and Goo Ball as quickly as possible. However, depending on the character, it may also be worth it to invest 1 or 2 points into an ability that's not part of your core kit. And for Viscous, it's absolutely worth it to invest 1 point into the Puddle Punch to get that second charge online. 2 charges of Puddle Punch makes a world of difference. You can displace twice as many enemies. You can do twice as many rollouts. It's just so versatile. There is no situation in which you'd ever not want to have this, is my personal opinion. But then after that, yeah, we just go straight into maxing out the Splatter, and then maxing out our Goo Ball, and then from there I usually like to max out the Cube for its superior cooldown reduction at tier 3, and then we finally finish off with the Puddle Punch. But yeah, as you can see, see, we're really prioritizing our big spirit damage dealing abilities here with the splatter and goo ball first. And yeah, once all of that is said and done, your build is basically completed. Now you might want to go back through and add some annotations to specific items if you feel like they need it. For example, you could add an annotation to Warpstone that says that you want to get it online about the same time as your goo balls tier 3, or you might just want to explain that, hey, Scourge is really important, or hey, if you need a lot of extra healing, you can get Infuser before Scourge, or something like that. And I usually annotate every single item for my builds because I intend for them to be used by other people, and so I want to make sure things are really clear. But you don't have to go that extra step if you don't want to. It certainly helps, but it is also time consuming. But yeah, now that our example ball build is finished, I want to show you some other build types that basically just cover different archetypes. And Viscous is just phenomenal at that because he has a build for basically every archetype. So yeah, first I guess let's talk about a gun build, because this is by far the most common archetype besides spirit damage builds. So this is a gun build I've been working on recently that I've had an absolute blast with. I haven't shown it off in a video yet, so I guess this is a bit of a spoiler, but yeah, it's my high viscosity rounds Viscous build. And you can see the differences already. We do still go for an early Mystic Burst just for a little bit of extra poke on our splatter. This is honestly kind of optional, but I find that it really helps, especially because when we add Quicksilver Reload on top of it, our splatter is pretty much one-shotting tier 1 camps, and that really helps us out for farming. But then, we go for a bunch of gun items. High velocity rounds is good on Viscous because his weapon is slow, but if you're playing a faster projectile character, then you don't necessarily need this. Extended magazine, rapid rounds are both phenomenal, and we upgrade those into Swift Striker and Titanic magazine for a ton of extra damage. And instead of going for Arcane Surge, we go for Kinetic Dash, which is honestly kind of broken. I mean, this gives extra stamina, and 30% fire rate, and extra ammo? For 1,600 souls? Like, bruh, that's insane. This is a ludicrous item. So, yeah, I absolutely picked this up on Viscous. And then we get some Bullet Lifesteal and Quicksilver Reload, which are also very common gun items. And then we have our mid-upgrade category and our late upgrade category. So we're going for some big power spikes here. We're going for Glass Cannon on Viscous, Burst Fire, Siphon Bullets, Vampiric Burst, Armor-Piercing Rounds, really fantastic items here. And then, after that, if we still have some souls and we have some slots available, we can pick any number of these upgrades here, and whichever upgrade we go for depends on the match that we're in. Then we have some situational items here. Most of these are the same as the other build, but we do have Toxic Bullets instead of Healbane because this is a gun build. We aren't doing nearly as much spirit damage, we don't have as much uptime on our abilities, and so this is by far the better option. Next, we have our Fist Kiss build, which is a punching archetype. So we have a lot of melee items in here. Melee Lifesteal is our first item. We're getting this even if we don't necessarily need healing in lane, although we probably will, because it also scales our melee damage and upgrades into Life Strike, which we absolutely want later on. We get extra charge because Viscous's Puddle Punch is a charged ability, and so this actually helps. Although if you're playing someone like Abrams, you would obviously want to skip this. This is kind of a Viscous exclusive. Melee Charge, fantastic melee item. Spirit Strike, obviously fantastic. And we're going for extra stamina here, but we're actually upgrading it into Stamina Mastery later because this gives way superior mobility. We need the mobility more than we need the buffs from either Kinetic Dash or Arcane Surge in this instance because we're trying to get up close to the enemies and we're doing rollouts with our many charges of Puddle Punch. So, yeah. Pick the stamina item based on what your build needs. Viscous can use all three because he's just awesome like that. And yeah, we also have rapid recharge, compressed cooldown for our punches, and just a whole bunch of melee items here. And melee builds can also scale their damage based on some gun damage items as well. So we have Berserker, Hunter's Aura, and Point Blank in this build as well, which all help us do a lot more melee damage. And our situational items, again, are pretty much the same, and I actually have this category ahead of the late upgrades category for some reason. Don't worry too much about that. And our late upgrades are kind of just a little wonky too. Most of the time, like 90% of the time, I never get to this category anyways, so it's kind of just an afterthought for this specific build. But yeah, our situational items, again, you can kind of see are pretty standard. And finally, we have a support build, and a support build is focused on using the items that are able to help your team out. So, we have monster rounds for our one gun item, we have healing right, incorporated into the actual build order because we're upgrading that to Rescue Beam. And the fundamental idea of this playstyle with Viscous is to cube our teammates as often as possible whenever they are in danger from an enemy attack, and then we can use the Rescue Beam to pull them out. So, we have Guardian Ward in here as well to give them some extra HP. We upgrade Healing Right into Rescue Beam. We get cooldown reduction from Enchanter's Emblem, and also cooldown reduction on our cube from Compressed Cooldown, and then we go straight into Echo Shard to allow us to cube twice. And then we get some other items, including Mystic Expansion to make it easier to hit the cube, Superior Cooldown, and Transcendent Cooldown as well for just maximum uptime on everything, the cube, the rescue beam, the echo shard, etc. Divine Barrier to give our teammates even more HP and also to cleanse debuffs. And then we also build for some crowd control with Curse, because that's another way that we can support our team. Now, support builds are definitely the least common archetype because it's really hard to support in Deadlock. Support builds usually come at the cost of having basically no damage, and your teammates are generally gonna suck. Like, in random matches throughout the ladder, especially if you're at the middle of the ladder or below, so, you know, Oracle, Archon, Emissary, ranks like that, your teammates are gonna be all over the place in terms of their quality. You're gonna get really good teammates some matches, really terrible teammates other matches, and so these builds just aren't consistent, unfortunately, but they can be very fun if you actually have some reliable teammates to play them with. So, yeah. That's, I guess, a little bit of a disclaimer when it comes to support builds. But yeah, that's gonna do it for this video on the basics of build crafting in Deadlock. And yeah, I really hope this video was helpful to you if you're a new or returning player and you're trying to figure out how to make a build with the new item store. Because yeah, it's a lot to cover, it's a lot of thinking, you definitely have to familiarize yourself with a lot of the new items, and you have to know how to think about making builds. There's a lot that goes into the process, and I hope I've broken it down in an easy to understand way. So if you found this video to be helpful, then of course make sure to drop a like, and of course subscribe down below for more videos from me. And also, if you really want to support the channel and keep me making guides as well as other fun videos for you, then I would really appreciate it if you would check out our memberships program linked down below. You can get a ton of perks such as emotes and badges that you can use in the comment section and on my live streams, and you can also gain access to a bunch of perks on the Discord server as well, which is also linked in the description. So yeah, I would really appreciate your support if you want to go the extra mile and really help this channel out. But with all that being said, thank you guys for watching. I will see you all next time. Peace out.